world free of bias means that we can reach the higher levels of a diverse, equal world by connecting wires that have us to be those positively charged particles. And we, together, are going to break the bias so that we forever will no longer fear fighting for better. There is a bias to be broken. My dream of an equal world is what I have awoken from, and I know that it's something that can become true, as the world is a living photograph saturated with diversity and hues. I march and I strive, with my head held high as a woman, and us women will not be pinned down nor weighed down by anything, no matter how hard that anything tries. We all have different stories. We take each day as it comes, by painting the picture, by writing the literature, to be shared with the world. We will choose to challenge, and we will break the bias, and find strength and pump our tires and drive down the open road by taking the steering wheel. We'll rise up from our heels until it is love, confidence, and everything positive that we feel, and until our stories are revealed to the world. Because this is us. We're born to be leaders and born to be great. So let's continue to create our stories in a world where we no longer fear fighting for better.
Good morning, Dr. Brenda, guest speakers, representative of the Consulate General of the United States, Hong Kong and Macau, the Gender Studies Program, School of Humanities, the Committee on Gender Equality and Diversity, Faculty of Arts, and the Common Core Office at HKU, and fellow participants. Welcome to the Women's Month 2022 Virtual Roundtable discussion. I am Millie, and I will be your moderator for today's session. The International Women's Day 2022 campaign is themed Break the Bias. Imagine a gender-equal world, a world free of bias, stereotypes, and discrimination, a world that is diverse, equitable, and inclusive, a world where difference is valued and celebrated, a world in which we can forge women's equality. To achieve our goal of breaking the biases, we need to take action to put an end to biases and create a better environment for women to work and live in. Hence, we are very delighted to have a roundtable discussion titled Making a Positive Difference for All Women, Break the Bias, where we will talk about the reasons and importance behind Women's Day celebrations. Besides, our roundtable discussion will also explore the current situations of women's visibility projects, asking questions such as what is missing in these current projects and what else we need to see in future women's visibility projects. After participating in a roundtable discussion, we truly hope all of our participants would be able to gain meaningful insights and formulate their own answers to the above questions. Without further ado, I would like to officially mark the beginning of our roundtable discussion by taking the opportunity to introduce our organizer and guest speaker, Dr. Brenda. Dr. Brenda Alegre holds a PhD in psychology. She finished her PhD with magna cum laude honors at the University of Santo Tomas. Her MA thesis and doctoral dissertation were both about transgender women. She is currently among the board of directors of STRAP, the Society of Transsexual Women Advocates of the Philippines and ILGA Asia. Brenda is a lecturer at the University of Hong Kong, where she teaches at the Gender Studies program, with upcoming publications on transgender people's experiences. As an activist for LGBTQIN women, she has been featured as an expert in TV and radio programs. In 2018, Brenda was awarded the LGBT+ Public Champion in Hong Kong and delivered a speech at the United Nations Human Rights Council in June of that year. Besides, Brenda is also a choir soprano. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Brenda to give her opening speech. Dr. Brenda, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Millie. Mabuhay. Good morning or magandang umaga, as you would say in the Philippines. This is not really going to be a formal speech, but it's just a way for me to say maraming salamat or thank you to all of our sponsors, our participants, and our friends slash guest speakers, the brilliant, amazing women who are going to be joining us today, for this virtual panel. I know we waited a couple of months, and now we're here. This has been the labor of love and hard work from our course teams. I would like to thank the class, did I say it right? Team, Meg, who's here with us today, and also Raj, who's also here with us today. And so I would like to also extend my gratitude to the CGED, or the Committee on Gender Equality and Diversity, led by our chair person, Professor Gina Marchetti, who's also joining us today, and Georgina Chalin, who thank you also to the Gender Studies program, Dr. Elizabeth Lacouture, and the entire GSP team. Thank you to the School of Humanities, in particular, our head of school, Professor David Pomfret. Thank you to the Common Core Office, has also been constantly supporting us, Professor Gray Lindgren, and the entire Common Core team. And of course, thank you to our amazing friends who will be introduced shortly. An extra thank you I would like to extend, to this group who have supported us. That if not for them, this virtual panel would not be possible because of their support. So that is the U.S. Consulate for Hong Kong and Macau, led by Adeline, Serena, Kitty, and Thomas. So I think they are joining us today. So thank you so much for your constant support. Today is Women's Month, but actually Women's Month should be every month. Women's Day should be every day. Transgender Day of Visibility should be every day because we're visible every day. Women's Day should be every day. Transgender Day of Visibility should be every day because we're visible every day. We don't choose a day to be visible. Women don't choose a day to be visible, but we're just we selected this day as a time for us to be reminded of the struggles, the oppressions that women face on a day-to-day basis, and what we have been doing, what women around the world and allies, have been doing to address those issues. But we're also here to share with you our successes, and what we have been doing the past years, and what we can still do so that we can make this world a gender equal world, hopefully. And every day we break the bias. So without further ado, I hand you back to our amazing moderator, who's from our class, Millie. Thank you. I'm going to see you again before the end of the session so that I could give my reaction or my to close the session later. I hand it back to you, Millie. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brenda. I would now like to move on to introduce our guest speakers. Firstly, I would like to introduce Ms. Sonia Wong. Based in Hong Kong, Sonia now teaches gender and culture-related subjects at the Gender Studies program of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Her research interests include lesbian identity, female sexuality, film, and new media. In 2013, she founded Real Women Hong Kong, the first and only independent film festival in Hong Kong devoted to the promotion of female creative films and artworks, as well as gender equality and awareness in society. In 2018, she co-founded the Women's Festival with Chantal Wong from Inton, Hong Kong, and Vera Lau from Sally Coco, celebrating self-love, self-care, and self-expression. Apart from being a community organizer and advocate, she is also a writer and visual artist. May we welcome Ms. Sonia Wong.
Hey everyone.
Next, we are very delighted to have invited Ms. Vera Lau. As the founder of Sally Coco since 2010, Vera was determined to bring the first female-friendly, intimate lifestyle store to the people of Hong Kong. Born and raised in this sex-taboo city, she has experienced herself and witnessed others suffer from the lack of sex education. In 2012, she started an unstoppable movement with her sex education channel on YouTube, which now has 100,000 subscribers and 20 million views. After years of face-to-face conversations with women from all walks of life, she has realized self-love is truly the key to happiness. With the passion of spreading her message, She has partnered with Inton Workshop and Real Women Hong Kong to launch a new kind of women's festival in 2018. Together, they wish to create an open platform for women to explore many topics, from body positivity, mental and physical wellness, motherhood, to spirituality and sensuality. It's a festival inspired by all women for all women. May we welcome Ms. Vera Lau.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
We are also very honored to have invited Ms. Maririsa, aka Tekla. Tekla is a single mother and has lived in Hong Kong for the past decade as a domestic worker. She is a writer and an advocate who wants to call on people to have the courage to fight the good fight. Her belief in standing up for the truth and helping others share their stories had made her an avid writer. After undergoing journalism training, Tekla became a regular contributor to The Sun, a Hong Kong-based bi-monthly Filipino newspaper. Tekla is a member of the Sun Writers Club, where she often writes about migrant domestic workers who are suffering injustices. Tekla is particularly passionate about reporting on gender-based violence because many fellow migrant domestic workers face this issue and have normalized it. Furthermore, Tekla is also the vice president of the Baytangao, a group of Filipino migrant domestic workers who are dedicated to promoting Filipino heritage and history in Hong Kong. She is also the founder of Social Justice for Migrant Workers Facebook group for domestic workers to seek social rights, which now has accumulated over 24,000 members by now. May we welcome Tekla.
Hello, good morning, everyone.
Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Mikey and Campbell. Dr. Mikey is an assistant professor in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at California State University, San Marcos, where she teaches trans and queer of color studies. Her work centers on trans representation in Philippine and Asian film and media, and she currently serves on the board of Inter-Asia Cultural Studies Society. She is also a senior fellow at the Center for Applied Transgender Studies. As an activist, she has extensive experience advocating on trans issues in global spaces, and has served on the board of the ILGA World, as well as on the grant-making panel of the International Trans Fund. She is also a board member of the Society of Transgender Women of the Philippines, the country's first and longest-running trans-centered organization. Along with Dr. Brenda of the University of Hong Kong and Dr. Jaya of Coventry University, Dr. Mikey is the co-editor of Trans Filipinas Anthology, an upcoming collection of fiction, poetry, prose, and art for and by trans and gender diverse Filipinos. May we welcome Dr. Mikey.
Hi.
Thank you, Dr. Mikey. Last but not least, I would like to introduce Ms. Joscelyn and Inton Campbell. Joscelyn is a researcher with OMNI Institute, a US-based NGO using research to accelerate social change, and a PhD candidate in peace and conflict studies at the University of Otago. Later this year, Joscelyn will be co-editing a special issue of Peace Review on transgender intersections with peace and violence with Dr. Mikey. She has previously served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco and a Rotary Peace Fellow in Japan. Her work aims to highlight the way transgender communities work to build peace and justice in the face of violence, including the need to queer the women, peace, and security agenda. May we welcome Joscelyn.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be here.
Thank you. So before we start our roundtable discussion, we would like to acknowledge the Swin House Foundation as our beneficiary for today's event. So we would now like to move on to the general questions. Our first question is, the celebration of days such as International Women's Day is crucial in gathering attention to raise awareness for equality. What does Women's Day mean to you, and why is it so important? Perhaps we could invite Ms. Sonia Wong to answer our first question.
Thank you, Millie. Thank you for your question. As Brenda has just said, every day should be Women's Day. And also, like from Vera's introduction, we held Women Festival, or we thought of like Women Festival as our way of celebrating Women's Day, because traditionally we thought of Women's Day being something that is really traditional, something that is really exclusive in a sense that probably they were envisioning when we are growing up as girls and later becoming women. We thought of our way of understanding, or the way that we have learned about Women's Day traditionally is about women fitting in the more traditional social roles. So when we grow up into being women that are not exactly in the box, or not exactly the kind of woman that everyone agrees with or particularly like or appreciate, we kind of feel like out of place, and there's nowhere in like traditional Women's Day program that address what we care about as human being, but not only as women. And so we thought of like the Women's Festival as an alternative place for people to talk about, to address what is happening in our life, our concerns, our thoughts and ideas, to really come together not only as women, but also as human beings. And recently, after working quite closely with the migrant domestic workers community, I really learned what it means to be seen and heard and stand together for one another. So that is what I have learned of Women's Day like recently. So probably a short answer from me for now.
Yes, thank you, Sonia. Surely the Women's Day is a very comfortable space for all women from all fields to speak up about their concerns. Maybe we could also invite other speakers to add on to this question.
I can go. Hi, thanks again for having us. This is a really nice opportunity to be able to talk about these things. My thing about Women's Day is I understand that it's important. I know that there has to be a space to talk about women's issues, talk about women's rights, and we have to, dedicate an entire month to celebrating women. But we have to be mindful about the category of woman, because as Sonia said, there are many expectations of women, and many of these expectations fall in with patriarchal ideals, motherhood, raising your children, staying in the home, so the domestic space. So the other thing that I want to kind of flag is who gets to call herself a woman. So womanhood is not just a biological phenomenon. It's not just a series of chromosomes. It's not just a series of biological traits. It's also a sociological way of falling into the world, right? It's also a sociological category. So Women's Month has a long history of not being completely inclusive. In spaces like this, where you have trans women like Brenda and me and Joss, we're trying to do a better way of celebrating Women's Month. So we have to kind of bring to the surface these intersections, which I think we will be talking about a little bit more later. But for now, I think I want to flag those two things. That one, it's really important that Women's Month exists, that Women's Day exists, because we have to celebrate women, because for the longest time, women have been kept out of public discourse. But two, the category of woman should be inclusive. So we shouldn't just be talking about cis women or about trans women. We should also be talking about Black women, Indigenous women, right? So we have to be able to look at those intersections. That's it for now.
Thank you, Dr. Mikey, for shedding light on this perspective and reminding us that we should all be inclusive on categorizing different people. So would other speakers like to answer this question?
Yeah, thank you for being here. Yeah, Women's Day is a day to celebrate all women's achievements and examine what obstacles stand in our way. It is an important day, but it's often only celebrated or marked by women and institutions which have the time, space, and platforms to do so. The poor, excluded, and marginalized women don't have the privilege of marking it themselves. Many of these women are unaware and undervalue themselves, so they don't feel they should be recognized or celebrated, as most of their life they have been treated as inferior.
Thank you, Tekla, for a very inspiring answer. And perhaps we could move on to the next question first. So our next question is, it is not easy to break biases, and it takes immense strength to step forward to be yourself and share your beliefs. Could you share one instance of calling for equality that took tremendous courage, or perhaps another example of a female leader that demonstrated tremendous courage that had a lasting impact on you? Perhaps we could invite Ms. Vera Lau to answer a question.
Hi, everyone. Well, thank you for the questions. I was actually talking to Sonia and when we were discussing this year Women's Festival, how one of a mentor that I had when I was still doing animation. So back in 2009, 2010, I was still an animator. So I had a mentor, her name was Sidney Bauman, and she was one of the very few women in the animation industry who were acting as a role of director and making her own independent animation shorts or animation features. And she was my mentor. And when I was working with her, she had a series of animation shorts. Usually they're like 60 seconds or 2 minutes long. And then she talks about her sex life in those animated shorts. And the way she talks about it is very sex positive and also pleasure driven. And back when I was that age, my sexuality and my sex life were still struggling. And she was actually the very first person who opened my eyes to the world of pleasure. And when we go to film festivals, when she shows her film to fellow animators or festival goers, when people hear the words coming out of her mouth and when they see the shorts and what it talks about, a lot of them see it as of course, like funny and like it's really joke-ish, but then at the same time, it's very eye-opening for people to see a woman talk about her own sexuality and her own pleasure experience in a big screen full of men. So that has a very lasting impact on me. And I think that is one of the source of why I do what I do now.
Yes, thank you very much for your personal and genuine experience with us. I'm sure we have a lot to reflect on about some stereotypes in society. So do other speakers want to add on to this question?
Yeah, the leader whom I admired is no other than Maririsa, the Nobel Peace Prize awardee, the CEO of Rappler, who stood up to defend the freedom of the press in the Philippines. So they showed facts about the extrajudicial killings in my home country. For myself, at this time when domestic workers have lost their jobs just because they got COVID, I created awareness of this through social media platforms. And the response was overwhelming as it was aired on TV networks and the government said that employers will be fined. Many individuals came forward and have been donating supplies to help these destitute domestic workers. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for sharing. Would Ms. Joscelyn like to contribute to this question as well?
Yes. When I read this question, I thought of a very particular person, Dr. Meredith Bacon. She was the first trans woman I ever met. She was my professor in undergrad, and she taught me two very important things about what it means to lead. One thing is that she chose to transition very late in life, and she put her entire career on the line at a time when trans women were still regularly murdered in my hometown, when police still harassed them, and it was legal to for the police to do so. And it is something where she chose to come out and transition to open the way for others. And that's a key thing that I learned, is that to be a woman and be a leader means to put things on the line, take risks to open the way for others. The other thing, though, is that she fought very hard for anti-discrimination legislation and for changing things at the university from behind the scenes. And that leading doesn't always mean putting yourself out in a visible space, but also making it so that others can make these changes possible. So that's a leader who is a woman who still inspires me today.
Yes, thank you very much for your inspiring example. And it is really important to take risks and to also take actions to eliminate these stereotypes. So maybe now move on to the next question, which is, how do you challenge gender stereotypes and biases in your field of work? Perhaps we could start with Mikey.
Sure. So I teach trans and queer of color studies. My department is very small. There's only 3 full-time faculty members. The rest are lecturers. So we're basically building a program from scratch. And they brought me in so that I can talk about the more controversial topics. So I'm designing courses on sexuality and pleasure. I'm designing courses on LGBT studies, on queer theory, all of the things that when associated with womanhood would put that woman in a minority, further in a minority. So my classes highlight the writings of queer women of color, the Combi River Collective, Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, a bunch of other Black feminists, and women of color feminists, Latina feminists like Gloria Anzaldúa. So the way I kind of break the bias is by introducing controversial topics, quote unquote controversial, right? And then talking about them and normalizing these things, that women are queer, women are women of color, and women have a sexuality, and women should be allowed to have pleasure in their sexuality. And I'm sure Vera and Sonia can talk more about this, but personally, that's what I do to break the bias. Through my classes, students engage with topics that they might not normally encounter in their other courses. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I'm sure these very controversial topics are very important and meaningful topics that could help improve our society towards equality. So perhaps we could invite other speakers to talk about this question.
Yeah, we show Hong Kongers that female domestic workers are not passive, unskilled, or powerless to change our situations. We run workshops that help empower women and show their worth so they are able to stand up for themselves in their workshop with families as wives also.
Yes, thank you, Tekla. I'm sure you have set a really good example for all migrant workers to stand up for themselves and to help eliminate biases. So do other speakers want to contribute to this question as well?
I think us being us are really challenging. Like in the first place, for being young and female and unmarried and refusing to have kids and pansexual, or like putting ourselves out there in a way, like putting our bodies out there, putting what we do out there. And a lot of the times in what I do, I try to make everything personal and daily. In that, when I introduce like controversial topics like Mikey and every one of us do, I try to show students and the public that everything is connected, and that like it is not just theories or things that are related to other people that we are talking about, but it is about us, it is about our everyday life. That in this we are all human and together. And yeah, so that is probably my take on like breaking stereotype and biases, not only for gender, but in other ways. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm sure many of the topics that we encounter are actually very related to our daily lives as well. So maybe we can move on to the next question, which is, feminism is inherently linked to broader issues such as homophobia, transphobia, and racism. What importance, in your opinion, derives from intersectionality, and what can we do as a society to promote it? So maybe we could start with Ms. Joscelyn.
Yeah, this is a question that I think a lot of people hear the word intersectionality, and there's a lot of misconceptions about how to understand this term. It is not merely that we are saying people have multiple identities and therefore multiple ways things will hit. It's not just that people can be a woman and be affected by sexism and low income and affected by classism. No, it's that classism will hit a low income woman differently through her gender is how it will occur. And this is how it works with transphobia, homophobia, and racism. I think it's really important to understand, for example, often there are efforts to address these prejudices through visibility by making people out in the open. I mean, that's what we're doing today, and it's important. But it's also important to understand that, for example, many trans women, when they are made visible, they're also being made vulnerable. They're made targets. This happens to a lot of queer women too, who are not trans. And it's something that we need to understand, that sexism is not just going to travel along one pathway towards everybody. These travel through our different identities and hit us. And if we want to make a change, we need to address it along those different avenues that they end up hitting us. I can go on about that later, but I'm sure we'll get to more about that.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure there's still a lot of work that we could all do to improve our society. So the other speakers want to add on to this question.
Thank you, Joscelyn, for your great explanation. I think it's a really short and concise way of telling people what intersectionality really means. But in my recent work, or when I'm working with students, it's not only understanding how a certain label and identity or social roles and position would be affecting another person. But I find intersectionality also a really good, probably not the proper use or the most common way of using intersectionality, but to understand our own biases, where it comes from and where it will show that we are affected by so many factors, that we have learned so many things. That a lot of the times, for example, the appalling treatment of migrant workers by Hong Kongers in Hong Kong is not only a product of sexism or racism alone, but a combination of post-colonialism, of capitalism, and geopolitics, and so on. And so to help people understand that they are also a product of all those interconnected ideas, that it will affect people, and in a lot of times also it will come back to us in some way, I think is my recent understanding of intersectionality in probably in a reverse sense. Yes.
Thank you very much for your inspiring answer. So would other speakers like to answer this question as well?
Yeah, for my understanding, intersectionality is important, as it links to all people who face discrimination. So together, we are stronger on challenging all forms of bias. We can highlight these links and form broader coalitions. So working together, we form stronger bands and alliances that can help each other, especially from us, the domestic workers community.
Yes, thank you very much for sharing. I'm sure it's very important for all of us to really work together and form alliances. So maybe we can now move on to the last general question, which is, have you experienced any internalized biases because of the way in which society views women and non-binary people? If so, how did you overcome this? Perhaps we could invite Ms. Vera Lau to answer this question first.
I think, well, I would say I also have internal biases that I put onto myself as well, because I grew up in Hong Kong and I was raised in the traditional Chinese family. My mom is a stay-at-home mom. My dad goes to work, and this is the form of family or gender role that I was growing up and seeing. So when I was thinking about my life and what I want to get married or have kids, I personally also think that this type of gender role and how a family should be, I have this kind of vision as well. And I don't think that I have ever overcome it. I feel like I'm still kind of stuck in this framework. But what I think is, since I've met so many different people like Sonia, like Brenda, and other amazing women or men who are more progressive and liberal in the sense of, gender and sexuality, I feel like I really respect their choices, and I also know that my type of ideal family or gender role is actually how I grew up seeing is not really what the reality is. Like the reality is very diverse. Everyone have their own life to be, and then they can make their own life choices, and they can embrace that as well. But I feel like a lot of people in my generation, or how like in the way that how I grew up, also still have these kind of biases and of how other people should live their life. So now, since I've learned so much about these like genders and sexuality, things like that, I try to see things from other people's perspective and see what the causes and conditions are to contribute to their situation, and why do they make those choices, or why they want to have the life like they want to, right? So that's that's my 2 cents.
Thank you for sharing. I'm sure this really shed light on how many biases are actually shaped by family upbringing, and how inherent biases are actually in today's society. And more importantly, how important it is for us to really learn more about different perspectives and to really work towards breaking biases in our society. So perhaps we could invite other speakers to add on to this question.
I can go. Thank you, Vera. That was super honest. I really like that answer. This is a really hard question because, like, as Vera said, and as Millie said, we all grow up with these biases. So for me, it's always very jarring because these biases come with certain expectations of other people, right? And many times these expectations are not met, and we learn something else, right? So for me, it's always a matter of having to step back and asking myself where these ideas are coming from, who taught me these ideas, and how are these ideas shaped by the media that I consume. You know, I watch a lot of Korean dramas, so I'm looking for a Korean boyfriend. But that's kind of a bias that I'm forming based on all of the stuff that I consume, right? And there's a lot of things that I need to unlearn, not just with Korean men, but with any other group, minority or otherwise, right? We all have these implicit biases, and it all becomes a matter of unlearning the things that we have been taught to learn, and learning new ways of thinking around the world, right? But it's a really hard thing to do, and it's a lifelong project because we are programmed to think in certain ways, to categorize the world in certain boxes. And it really does take a lifetime to learn many of these things. So it's something that I think we need to encourage students, parents, teachers to keep doing, because it's something that has to happen constantly until we die, basically. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I think it really shows how we really should keep a critical mindset when it comes to media consumption, and how we should all take time to reflect on the reasons behind these biases and stereotypes and come up with our own answers to unlearn them. So this is the end of our general questions, and we can now move on to the speaker-specific questions. So we will now first start with Ms. Sonia Wong. So our first question is, due to the fact that media and the film industry can shape cultural perceptions and attitudes towards gender, what effect has the portrayal of women had on gender stereotypes? And how do we as a society work to dismantle these ideas?
So I study media and film like Mikey does. And I think like we would both agree that in this time and age, consumer power is something that is very, very powerful. Now media productions are interacting more and listening more to what society wants and what people have to say about it. And I think it is like a golden age in some way, golden age of answerability of them to what like society demands, in a way that if we use our consumption power, if we use our influence on media producers like correctly and responsibly, it is very likely that change will be made. As we can see, even though like in the recent 5 years, we see an increasing number of, how do you say, really consciously trying to live up to the Me Too movement or the aftermath of the Me Too movement, trying to talk back to stereotypes, trying to create more positive and diverse image of women, non-binary people on screen. That probably to a mixed result. But then you can see how it has become a phenomenon. It has become common sense. It has become something hip and correct, politically correct to do. And I think that testifies to the power of public opinion, of consumption power, and of like us pushing the agenda. And so if we are going to support media products that deserve the support, then we are going to get the media product that we deserve. And I mean, vice versa, if we are not supporting things that are doing right, people who are doing good, then we are probably going to get like the negative stuff that we have always been getting. And so, of course, in this day and age where like technological advancement made it much more easy for like common viewers to become producers. So I encourage for those who are creative, who are actively taking the prosumer role, like Vera does, to not to politicize everything, but to think before you contribute to the whole media landscape, because algorithm is going to feed people the kind of things that people always like to click on, and to diminish that kind of content is really something that like needs every one of us contributing. So yeah, I am hopeful, but yes, so we should use like our creative power, our consumption power, and our voices like wisely.
I really believe that we as consumers will be able to help to create a virtuous cycle in which we affect the film industry, and then the film industry will also positively contribute to breaking the biases in society. So since Sonia just mentioned about the Me Too movement, maybe we could now move on to the next question, which is, what influence did the Me Too movement have on the film industry in Hong Kong, and more broadly, feminism? And what can we learn from this movement?
I am very ashamed to say that Me Too movement left like very little to no mark on Hong Kong society in the narrow sense of speaking about the movement, because I think Hong Kong is one of the places that did worse in terms of connecting with the Me Too movement, and there was only ever one victim who stood up, and her case didn't receive a very favorable sentence in court, and the whole online and media backlash to the brave survivor who stood up drove her underground, basically. And so there was like no one else who ever stood up, and it was sad. Basically, it was very sad. In terms of Me Too movement having an impact on Hong Kong, I think it is not only because of the Me Too movement. I said because of the declining of Hong Kong's economy, because of like film industry running into a very difficult situation to catch up or to compete with like global media production, that in recent years they have developed, basically they have adopted to the situation, and they develop a new strategy of investing in smaller films. And that have a very surprising outcome of enabling a lot of independent filmmakers, and a lot of them women as well, to create films that are less mainstream. They are talking about social issues. They're talking about like often left out story of women and other socially marginalized group. And I think that, even though unintended, brought very interesting work to the long, unexciting Hong Kong film industry. But of course, in terms of like outside of the film industry, in public, in other medias, in magazines, in newspaper, and even in online media, there are much more discussion of like Me Too movement, of feminism in general, even though of course we can always like question the kind of popular or hip feminism that is much too simplified and being circulated without in-depth understanding, and often with a lot of brand agenda, like commercial agenda behind. But definitely after the Me Too movement, it had become something that is of a common sense, at least in terms of popular vocabulary among Hong Kong people. And as to from what we can learn from the movement, I think the thing that I learned about the movement the most is how it failed in Hong Kong and what it tells us about the society that we think of as international, is progressive, is inclusive, or is gender equal. I mean, like to a very large part, that it is still like very much an illusion, and so more to work on, like as Mikey said.
Yes, thank you very much for sharing. And I'm sure there's still a lot to work on in order to make Hong Kong a more inclusive society. And hopefully with the trend of more independent movie makers, there would be more representations about the Me Too movement and feminism in Hong Kong. So perhaps we could move on to the next question, which is, what do you think are the most effective ways to counteract the negative stereotypes of feminism?
Negative stereotype being, can you be slightly more specific? Sorry.
Negative stereotypes of feminism.
Negative stereotype of feminism. I think there is no effective way of dealing with negative stereotype of feminism, because in a very personal way, people who have grudges or who have negative stereotype on feminism are usually people who are having a lot of stake in the current society. And when their interests are being threatened, no one likes what they have in hand to be taken away, or to think about the prospect of it ever be taken away. For me, I believe in advocating for a renewed understanding of power. That power is something that everyone can have and should have, instead of like, when I have power, you get something to lose. Because a lot of the times what we think that we should be having are a lot of time privileges that result from the exploitation and the oppression of other people. But the most effective way of helping people understand feminism, I think, is by everyday, by small resistance, and is how we are doing it in our most daily, mundane relationships. If we can practice like ideas of equality, of respect, of care, of empathy in our relationship with the environment, with our neighbor, with our family, or with our most intimate partner, then they would know that it is not something that is meant to threat, but it is something that is meant to create something that is more beautiful. Yeah, so like for me, the most effective way would be to start from something that is small and everyday practices.
Yes, I'm sure, although maybe everyday actions, they are very small good deeds, but collectively as a society, we would be able to make massive impacts to improve our society. So thank you, Ms. Sonia, and we will now move on to our next speaker, who is Ms. Vera Lau. So our first question is, how did growing up in a sexually conservative city influence your attitude and perception of sex when you were younger? Did a lack of sexual education stimulate an interest in you to break the bias surrounding societal attitudes towards sex?
Well, I think growing up in a sexually conservative city and also household definitely made an impact on how I think about sex. To be honest, when I was younger, I have no idea what sex is. I didn't know that sex is a big umbrella and there's so many different kinds of categories or terms underneath it. But then also, I was not interested in it. I didn't think of it myself as a sexual being. And it was not until I got into I want to say toxic relationship, but not a great relationship. And how the sex life we had in that relationship really took a toll on me, on how, like, my body image. And also I was really not interested in having sex with that person, but I still did it anyway because I thought that was what a girlfriend should do. Those are the choices that I made because I didn't have any sort of positive sexuality education when I was growing up. So that relationship really hit me a big way. And I think it's because I suffered and there were things that happened to me that I thought if I knew more when I was younger and if I had the education that I was supposed to have about sex, then maybe these things would not happen to me. So that's why I wanted to talk about pleasure-based sexuality education or positive sex education, is because I think education and knowledge empowers people to speak up and to respect and have consensual intimate relationship. So that's why I wanted to do what I do now.
Yes, thank you. I'm sure many of us were able to relate to the part when we know nothing about sex when we were young, especially living in this very conservative city. But it also shows how important it is for us to have comprehensive sex education, because it actually affects our decisions in life in many ways. So perhaps we could move on to the next question, which is, in conversations around pleasure, men are seemingly always confident in their voices. They have been taught about pleasure through formal education, the media, and society as a whole for their entire lives, while female pleasure is rarely acknowledged. Even language shows a male bias with a lack of female equivalent for the word virility. Instead, the expression of female pleasure is often criticized or scandalized, while the male counterpart is regarded simply as a fact of life. Since opening Sally Coco in 2010, what are the main changes you have noticed in society in relation to attitudes towards a female-centered pleasure?
I think since we opened and since we have been constantly educating the public about a woman's pleasure, female pleasure is pleasure, is also human rights, then I started to see changes, like, because we have been doing this for what, 11, 12 years now. And I see that our customer grew up with us, and then there are also people who have no idea about pleasure or orgasm, or they would never talk about their sexuality. They would come talk to us. So I definitely see the changes. But what I see now in our society is we have a group of people who I constantly talk to, or those are my audience. They are very forward thinking. They already embrace their own sexuality and pleasure, and they're all okay with female-centered pleasure. But there are also like a big group of people who still need to open their eyes or heart to accept that female pleasure is for them, or that is good for the society. But it's very hard to communicate the message to them. Maybe it's because of social media, how the algorithm works. It's like I feel like the forward-thinking people are already there, but then there are a whole bunch of people who are not there, or maybe they're not willing to be there with us. So I like right now, like for the past 2 years, I feel like I'm kind of struggling with communicating the message that I want to say to those people, and I generally don't know how to do this. But then that's the situation that I see in our society now. It's very extreme. Like either they're very progressive or they are very conservative, and they're not willing to listen to one another.
Yes, actually there are still a lot of factors in society that contributed to the conservativeness of different perceptions of people. So perhaps we could move on to the next question, which is, when you opened Sally Coco, what criticism or knockbacks did you encounter? And how did you work through this and stay persistent in your fight for female empowerment? How did you break the bias of not only patriarchal attitudes towards women in business, but also the perceptions people have of sex shops?
Criticism and knockbacks, tons. If you want to see it, you can go on my YouTube channel. And there are thousands of comments saying, why do you talk about sex in public, and you should keep this to yourself? And also one of the most common comment that I get is, you don't look as pretty as whoever. Why do you want to talk about sex? Like, by looking at your face, I already don't feel turned on. Like, why do I need to listen to you? So these are all some of the messages that I constantly get on the internet. So I would say when I was younger, when I see those comments, it really affected me. I was like, oh, I'm just trying to do good. Like, why would you say that to me, you know? But now, since I'm much older and wiser, I know what I'm fighting for. And I know I'm fighting for, as you said, female empowerment, or everybody empowerment, actually. So I know what I'm doing, and I know that there's gonna be people who hate me, or there's gonna be people who love me. So when people say something hateful, I always now see that, oh, maybe they're in pain, and maybe what they are saying is not really directed to me, or more it's just their way of releasing their anger to whatever they're not feeling good with. So this is how I face those kind of criticism now. And as of how I break the bias, I think when I first started making my first video about how to find the G area or G spots on YouTube with Cantonese, it really make people think, oh, maybe, like, some people would think, oh, this is just a regular Hong Kong girl talking about sex, opening a sex shops, telling people what kind of products they can use to explore their body. If she can do that, maybe this is something that I can do too. So I think to break the bias, we really need to get to ground level to let them know that if I can do it, you can do it too. And I'm just a normal person. I'm not anyone who has a high power in the society. And I'm just an ordinary Hong Kong woman who you would walk past the street, but I can still talk about this, and so can you.
Yes, I'm sure it's really important to acknowledge and know what we want as ourselves, but not what others want for us. And I'm sure we'll be able to learn a lot on your YouTube channel. So thank you for your sharing. And we will now move on to our next speaker, Tekla. So our first question is, what are some common misconceptions or biases people have towards domestic workers?
Yeah, most people think we are poor, uneducated women from small villages and provinces, and that we do this work because we have no skills or options at home. We are often viewed as second class and never citizens, and not seen as partners in the running of homes and in the caring of children or the elderly. People see us as a nationality and not person. They call us Philippine, Indonesia, and make assumptions about us based on stereotypes. They view our identity based on our jobs and not as individuals. Many of us actually are well educated and choose to come here to help the financial burdens of our families back home. With these stereotypes, we are thus treated as uneducated, and we are undervalued in the households, even though in many households we are called the CEOs, running the daily household happening, dealing with finances and their most precious possessions, their children.
Yes, I think it's really important for us to see each other as a person, but not really based on stereotypes and nationalities, as you had just mentioned. So we hope that in the future, our society could be more inclusive and we could all fight for equality. So our next question would be, many people argue that domestic work reflects the unequal relationship between men and women. Do you agree or disagree, and why?
There are 76 million domestic workers worldwide, and 76% are women. Whilst this is a vital source of employment, especially for women, it is seen as low status and is low paid. In many households where both couples work, it is usually the woman who has the additional burden of domestic work, and this is often tied to the idea of women as homemaker, especially if she ceases work to raise children, even if it is a short term. It's striking to me how much chores break down along gender lines. Of course, men do more of our usually outdoors, like car upkeep, garden work, and repairs. The course women do more of our indoors, like cleaning and cooking, The course men do happen weekly or less often, and the ones women do happen daily or several times a day. They are repetitive but essential. Masculinity is strongly tied to earning an income and to avoiding things that are considered feminine like housework. So called women's work like domestic work is low paid, and if it is done by a stay-at-home partner, it is unpaid, whereas someone coming into the home to do this gets paid, albeit poorly. Ironically, many of the domestic workers living abroad are the breadwinners for the families and earn higher salaries than their husbands, but don't always get the respect and appreciation they deserve for their hard work.
Yes, thank you for your sharing. And it really shows how some traditional biases are still in our society anyways. However, as you have mentioned, women can also be the breadwinners and take care of their family. So before we move on to the next question, we would like to congratulate Tekla for the recent Women Award by SCMP. So congratulations. Yay.
Thank you.
Okay, so we can now move on to the next question, which is, what do you think are the benefits of raising awareness about the injustices faced by domestic workers? And more broadly, why is it important for people to speak up in times of inequality?
If people have more insight into our lives and our struggles, it will encourage better employment conditions and ultimately better legal protection. It would become unacceptable for abuse and exploitation. It is very important for us to speak up because it empowers us to make the changes we need, and it means we are not relying on others to speak our stories and our demands. We should not be bystanders. If something is wrong, we should feel empowered to speak up and we should be protected. Hong Kong and a few other places in Asia and a few around the world, in that domestic worker live-in is common. Yet, this is how the minority of people around the world live. When children grow up in households and they see parents and grandparents constantly treating domestic workers as inferior, they copy this and they follow this negative role modeling and apply it in their households, and the cycle continues. So children need to be taught from young that we are equal and no one deserves to be treated as second class.
Yes, this is really important for us to speak up in times of injustices, and it will really make an impact on empowering us. So perhaps we can move on to the next question, which is, what do you think needs to be done to progress domestic worker rights and help alleviate the challenges they take?
The employment laws for domestic helpers really needs a radical overhaul. Hong Kong's economy and the economies of individual families could not make ends meet without cheap domestic help. Legislators know that locally in Asia, there will always be a supply of cheap migrant workers, often women, who will meet this need. At the moment, it is easy to exploit domestic helpers and put them in situations where they are easily abused. By insisting on the live-in rule, but setting wage levels, but not enforcing limited working hours, and by never enabling domestic workers to become permanent residents like other migrant workers here in Hong Kong. Agencies which recruit helpers are often part of the economic and social enslavement. They encourage debt. The laws around termination, leaving abusive situations, and finding new work also need changing, as a 2-week limit to remain and find a new contract puts pressure on us to find often yet another unsuitable position. Employers need to be reminded about the rights of domestic workers. So an idea is, every time the employers sign a new contract, they should be like undergoing a test driver's license. before they're signing a new maid.
Yes, thank you very much for sharing. And I'm sure there's still a lot to be done, no matter from the legislative, executive, or the contractual level. So in order to improve the lives of domestic workers. So we can now move on to the last question, which is, what effect has the recent COVID spike had on domestic workers in Hong Kong?
As we know, recently, COVID positive helpers have been thrown out from their homes or terminated. Some have been locked away into their small rooms and not fed adequately or taken care of by the household. COVID has just highlighted and magnified all the other issues which we face. Helpers have been targeted for gathering fines because we have nowhere to go on our day off. And then forced to go out, to leave the home for most of the day and need to work the whole day. Some helpers, on the other hand, have not been allowed to go outside in their days off and sometimes made them to do the housework the whole day. This means that workers never have been a rest at all. The other issues that COVID has thrown up is that we have not been able to see our families for 2 years. This has a huge impact since most of us have left young children back home who are in the care of elder and other infirm grandparents. It is also important that our children do not feel abandoned by us because we work away from them. As people have lost their jobs, they are not paying their helpers who are still working for no pay. Some have lost their jobs and not been able to return home as there are flight bans. Helpers have not been able to gather with friends and community members on a Sunday, which is a highlight of the week and a day to release stress. Many people are isolated in small apartments, so helpers have no time to themselves and are working double as hard from early in the morning and late at night. The stress in the households have also led to more abuses. This has been an exceptionally challenging time for us.
Thank you very much for a very touching and genuine sharing. So hopefully COVID will end soon and we can all resume to our normal life so we can all go meet our family members and receive better treatment. So thank you very much, Tekla, and we will now move on to Dr. Mikey. So our first question for Dr. Mikey is, in this tech-savvy era, much of our daily lives consist of some form of media content. As an expert yourself, how and in what way has media and film representation affected the understanding of different or creative biases towards groups of people, for example, people in the Asian, trans, or queer community?
Film and television, these stories inform us about the world around us. These are, the ways that we make sense of the world. Before the advent of social media, before Facebook, before Twitter, the stories that we had in film, on television are, this is how we got to know trans people, right? So if you examine the history of representation of trans people in Hollywood or in Asian cinema, they've always kind of been shaped very, very problematically. In Hollywood, especially, trans women are represented as deceitful. The transness is centered on medical transitioning. So if you don't medically transition, you're not really trans, right? So these are where we get our ideas from, right? It's changing now. I had a class the other day, and we were talking about trans issues, and I asked them, before me, had you ever met a trans person before? And about 70% of the class said yes, that I am not the first trans person that they've met. And that's kind of new, because when I used to do that in my other classes, 95% of the students would say, yes, you are the first trans person we've ever met. right? So in the absence of the ability to actually represent ourselves, the people who make the movies, the people who make television stories are the ones who are responsible for representing us, right? So today it's a little different. It's a little better, after 2013 with, what Time magazine called the trans tipping point, with, a flourishing of trans representation on American media, with Laverne Cox and Janet Mock and all of these other Black trans women making visibility. Now we are able to represent ourselves. Now we are able to kind of speak for ourselves because we have social media. We have Instagram, we have Twitter, we have Facebook. But before all of those things, it was film and media that told people what it was like to be trans, right? So that's how.
Yes, it is true that media often shapes our perceptions, and maybe even there are some times where media would be the main source of how we get information about the trans community and how problematic those perceptions might be. So hopefully the change towards the positive perceptions in the film industry could be persistent and for the better. And also hopefully we could all utilize social media to create a positive impact within the communities. So we will now move on to the next question, which is, undoubtedly, it's inevitable we get exposed to both positive and negative media content, and some are even inaccurate and hostile. On that note, how should we practice healthy media consumption to make sure we do not get influenced by inaccurate information?
That's a very complicated question. On the one hand, and I want to kind of talk about this in relation to what I said earlier, I really believe that trans people's voices should be centered in these conversations, in conversations around gender, conversations around queerness. I think trans people of color, especially indigenous trans people, have voices that have been historically left out of these mainstream conversations. And so I believe very firmly that trans voices need to be centered, and the media that we consume have to be written by trans people. This is part of the reason why Brenda and Jaya and I are editing this volume, the Trans Filipinas Anthology, because we want to, provide a platform for trans, gender diverse, queer Filipinos and their voices and their artwork, right? But now to the question of how do you practice social media consumption that is responsible and safe and healthy, there is no such thing, unfortunately, unless you completely cut out from the media, in which case you have no idea what's going on around you, right? I'm one of those people who are constantly on Instagram, constantly on Facebook. Joscelyn is much better at logging off. You have to be able to step back. You have to be able to step back from your media consumption, take them off your phones, et cetera, et cetera. But that's kind of drastic, even for me. But also, if you are someone like me who is constantly, on Instagram and on Facebook, then you're existing within an echo chamber of comments, thoughts, and opinions that you already know and that you already agree with. Because as Sonia mentioned earlier, the algorithm gives you things that you like. So one of the problems in the US right now is that right-wing conservatives exist in that echo chamber where, they get fed news from Fox News and all of these other conservative news sources that very often have fake news, while the liberals are also existing in their echo chamber with only MSNBC and CNN and Rachel Maddow and all of these progressive liberal news sources. So there's no conversation happening. Where do you have those conversations? You have them in person, you have them online, offline, you have them face to face, right? And if it's face to face, people are more likely to listen, people are more likely to learn. So while I appreciate that the new media, social media, have allowed trans voices to be heard, to be more visible, I also understand that there are limits to the use of social media, and face-to-face communication is really still the best way of talking about these issues and ironing things out and learning about each other.
Thank you for sharing, and I'm sure we should all stay conscious about the information that we receive on social media nowadays. And also, it's very important for trans people to get the opportunity to voice out. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to your upcoming publication. So yeah, thank you very
Me too,
much,
Brenda.
Dr. Mikey. So we will now move on to Dr. Charlton. So our first question is, as fake as social change appears, there are tangible methods developed through research and experiment that can accelerate bias breaking. Could you share some insight on how and what type of research positively impacts social change?
Yeah, so when we talk about research affecting social change, there's a couple of different ways that research can lead to that, right? I think most people already have the idea in their head of the academic route, right? You know, do research on a PhD, you become a professor, you teach people, it gets passed on to the next generation and things change gradually, it informs policies. I think most people have that kind of idea. Personally, that mode didn't really work for me. I wanted to work in a situation where we could research be a little bit more immediate. And a big part of that is, and this can be done by academics, by independent researchers. This is for people that are considering how they want to make a difference in the world that may be listening, is that you can pursue a career of research outside of that and engage with communities directly to build up their knowledge, like to develop an evidence base for the knowledge that they already have and help let them influence a new wave of research that can make change. So one area that especially I find very helpful for that's had a long history of engaging communities directly is called intergroup contact theory. This is an area I do a lot of research on myself. And this basically just comes down to when people from different groups come together, can it change attitudes, perceptions of each other's groups? But even more so, do those changes in attitudes and perceptions lead people to get engaged with collective action, begin working to change these bigger structures and problems? And there is a lot of important ways that this can happen. A big thing is to actually build relationships, not to just make it a one-off encounter with someone, not to just make things passive exercises, but to actively engage and learn about people, learn about people's experiences and how you can work together. Yeah, so that's one area of research that I think is a very useful way for positively impacting change, because in doing the research, you bring people together, you actively incite that possibility. So.
Yes, thank you very much for informative sharing. And I'm sure there's a lot of ways in which we can contribute in this field. So perhaps we can move on to the next question, which is, being extremely knowledgeable on gender-related intersections, could you shed light on some common misconceptions of, for example, the transgender community, and how we can build peace and justice through understanding one another?
Yeah, so when I talk about intergroup contact, you know, I imagine one thought that probably popped into some people's head, I know it did the first time I heard about it, was that, well, when it comes to like sexism and prejudice against women, everybody knows a woman in their life, most likely. I don't think there's too many people that are completely isolated from women. And part of what it comes down to is things like transphobia, sexism, many of these different isms, they are built up by piles and piles of media consumption, messages we get from families, all these different places that everyone else has talked about today and made such a great case for. If we want to change those misconceptions, it's really important to engage with them in ways that people aren't already expecting that go along those same lines. When we talked about intersectionality earlier, it's a similar thing that, for example, often people bring up, you know, we've seen so many debates going on in media about, should trans people be in sports? Should trans youth be able to access hormones? And I really like the researcher and activist, Sean Fay, has identified that these questions are not our issues. It's not what we need to have change. It is other people's issues with us. It is what other people are concerned. And a lot of times these questions that they keep throwing out are just really going to put us in a loop. We're just going to keep going back and forth, around and around and around, and nothing changes. The way that you break that is building direct relationships, but also by people don't reason themselves into prejudice. People don't sit there and like read up on why they want to be prejudiced against this group or that group, right? We learn it emotionally. We learn it indirectly through different parts of our environment. And so you have to act that way as well. You have to get at it through relationships, through human contact. And a big part of that is humanizing each other, learning to interact with each other that not just on surface levels, but that reveal the humanity in each other. I really appreciate, there's a YouTuber, Abigail Thorne, who part of the way she does this is that when she did her coming out video, when she did all these other things, she didn't do all of this, traditional trans media representation or only talk about trans issues. She just kept doing her thing, talking about philosophy and ideas on her YouTube channel and showing people that she's still this person that has all these other things to offer. Yeah, exactly. I think that's a really important way is to really break beyond ways that people expect us to interact and connect.
Yes, oftentimes it is the external sources that shape our perceptions, and it is really important for us to break the expectations our society has through personal interactions with one another and really understanding one another. So thank you very much for sharing. And we will now move on to the last question, which is, as a former Peace Corps volunteer and Rotary Peace Fellow, you're at the forefront of leading by example. Could you give some advice on how everyone and anyone can contribute to the cause of breaking the biases?
Yes, so there's two sides of this that I wanted to really emphasize. What we've already been talking about in terms of if we want to make some of these changes, part of it is we need to give people a chance to connect with others. We need to really work together. And so part of that is when I've had the privilege to serve as a Peace Corps volunteer and get to spend time in Morocco working with local communities, that door that was open for me, I had to invite them on through that door too. I had to make sure that people got to know the Moroccans that I work with and make sure that those people had opportunities to move forward in their lives and their goals as well. As Rotary Peace Fellow in Japan, again, it's something where I could act as a bridge to let people pass through that door. And that's an important thing, is to platform others' voices, to open that up further to everybody, break through those echo chambers and bubbles we live in. And a very practical way to do this yourself right now, everybody's probably got a phone or a computer in front of them. If you're watching this, I imagine, is if you're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, go search, top 10 Black women you should be following on this platform. Top 10 queer women talking about this thing or engaging with this issue, and just follow them, see what kinds of things they share, the ideas they bring up, the things that they do, because this is a way of actively causing yourself to have contact with them and bringing them into your world and giving yourself a chance to learn, and then share those people that really click with you. I love to search for musical artists I love whose music touches me, and then share that with others who might not, how many of you got a trans person in your Spotify playlist right now? Probably not too many. Maybe go search some, share them around.
Yes, thank you very much for sharing. And I think it really emphasizes how important connecting with one another is in order to break the biases. And hopefully we could all act as a bridge in some ways to contribute to the cause of breaking the biases, especially nowadays. It's very convenient for us to do so through social media, etc. So thank you once again for sharing, Dr. Joscelyn. And this will be the end of our specific questions. We will now move on to the Q&A session. Okay, I'll start first then. So my first question is, if you could have dinner with any inspirational woman, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Recently, I was asked this question, and I kind of at that time I was thinking about, I kind of want to have dinner or drink with the singer-songwriter Aurora, because she is a very inspirational figure. I particularly like her recent album to talk about gods that we can all touch, to demystify basically idols that we worship, and to make it relevant and human. And I am particularly inspired by one line in her, one line of lyrics in the song that she wrote called "Be a God in the Shape of a Girl." And I think that really testified to her belief in feminism that is that we are not only able to be the best of woman that we can be, but also be the best of everything, or be the best of human. That it is our goal that we eliminate boundaries, we break the bias that people hold against us, but also we hold against ourselves. So that, like, she should be a cool person to be having like dinner with.
This question.
I mean, I would probably say very similar things to Mikey in terms of I would love to talk to Judith Butler or someone like that, but probably I would just faint and fangirl out. Like I would be too excited. Someone who I would, you know, it's a very possible thing is Tori Peters, a trans woman author who wrote Detransition Baby that recently won quite a few different awards this last year. Her writing has hit me very, very intimately, and there's just so much that I would love to be able to ask her directly someday, just to understand where certain things came from and how they connected to me. So that'd be someone that I would want to talk to, but probably again, I just fangirl out and faint.
Thank you. So perhaps we can now move on to the next question. So we have received a question from Dr. Brenda, which is, do you have any recommendations or tips on how we can talk about the Laya Thompson situation?
This is a question that's always kind of plagued my classes. The issue is that Laya Thompson is a trans woman and she is a swimmer, and she recently won one race. She won one race, and in that day she ran 2 other races and she did poorly. So I'm kind of tired of talking about trans women in sports, because think about all of these things and think about who gets affected and who these laws and who these rules are deployed against. Very often, these are not deployed against trans women. They're deployed against cisgender Black women. Think about Caster Semenya, who is assigned female at birth, identifies as a woman, has an intersex condition, doesn't make her any less of a woman. But because her testosterone levels, her natural testosterone levels are too high, she is considered ineligible to run. And there are several other cases of Black women, Black cisgender women with no intersex conditions, whose testosterone levels are naturally higher. And like, if you look at the number of trans people who have won medals, there's so few of us already. And it's like, it all kind of boils down to transphobic and misogynistic ideas of what it means to be trans. And, you know, the stereotypical ideas of what a trans woman looks like, because people assume that they can tell who was trans and who was not. And very often that is not the case, right?
You know, as I mentioned earlier, I think a really important thing is to understand why these things get media coverage. And Sean Fay spells it out pretty clearly that, like, this is because it is a way for people to drum up, to put their concerns about us existing out there. And it is something that is actively serving agendas to limit our ability to exist in this world and to have livable lives. This doesn't just, you know, the fact is, it wasn't just limits on elite competition swimmers. There's laws in almost 20 states now that have been passed or considered that are restricting ability for children to participate in like children's sports. They're not out there to like win some big, you know, international competition. They're just wanting to play with their friends. And they're being shown, like, the authorities in their life, the adults in their life are saying, no, you are different and everyone needs to know you're different. You can't belong, you can't participate. And there's one thing that leads to. That leads to bullying, that leads to violence. This is part of that system of justifying the violence. We call this cultural violence a lot of times. There's narratives, ideas, symbols that are used to justify structural indirect violence. And it leads us going in circles over and over again, because you knock down one thing, oh, well, hormones don't actually do what you think they do. Oh, wait, actually, this is not going to affect sports performance. Oh, wait, this, and it never ends. And it's much better to point out, what is this actually doing? Who is talking about this and why? Maybe if more trans people were actually involved, like brought in to talk about what their actual concerns are in sports, such as I don't know, like trans women, like many women in sports, face sexual violence from coaches and others. So maybe those would be more our concerns, things that bring us together to fight for a better world.
Hi, I would like to follow up a bit from what Mikey and also Joss was saying. The first thing is like really a lot of the times those discussions are not only are usually like, I mean, the other times that when we hear about like biological advantage, we hear a lot about the targeted at like African American athletes or like athletes of color, saying that, oh, their genes are naturally help them build muscle mass more easily than like non-colored athletes, and so they have like advantage in the sport, so they are naturally better. So that probably of course to undermine how hard that they are training, how talented that they are. And so so where is it getting, and who is it speaking, or is it working against? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, like, I really agree with what Charles was saying, is that they are trying to drive us apart, and that they are now pitching trans women against women. So trans women are here to be threatening. Trans women are here to undermine the hard work that other fellow women athletes are paying. And so that is something that is of course a very vicious agenda. And the third thing is really also like echoing what Joss was saying about the existence of categories, basically the existence of how we like structure or how we conceptualize categories in sports. So there is like every time when we see any kind of competition, we see male and female, and that probably a lot of the times, especially in the past, they have different standards. While like the woman categories are supposed to be easier or less or have a lower benchmark, basically contributing, of course, reflecting as well as contributing back to how like the talent and hard work of female athletes are being underestimated in society, which reflect on what their wages, like sponsorships, and how like Serena Williams is not considered to be the greatest athlete, regardless of race, regardless of gender, of all time, right? And so like I think like also need like radical rethinking of how we, for example, think about like sports category or any kind of like categories in terms of infrastructure or in terms of competition, that we are telling people that there are other ways of separating people and there are other ways of identifying yourself. For example, that we probably could base it on weight or on other things other than like gender. But like we are either lazy or uncreative or both, right? Yeah, that's my input. Thank you.
So we have received a question from our audience, so may we invite Ian to ask his question?
Hi, yeah, first of all, I would just like to thank all the speakers for your amazing questions and answers. They were really so insightful, and I really thank you. I suppose my question is, it might seem specific to the US speakers, but it's not, it's more general. But like when you said, Mikey, about you're kind of sick of hearing about trans women in sports, and you know, we're seeing so much destructive kind of policies in America, specifically like Don't Say Gay in Florida, all of these things, and we're constantly seeing just people's identities and lives being debated in public forums, and just the damaging rhetoric. Even I was just watching the Ketanji Brown Jackson for its Supreme Court nominations, you know, the subtle racism, misogyny was really just quite horrible to see in her nomination hearings. And I suppose my question is, taking all of this into consideration and the impacts, the damaging impacts that it can have on people who are experiencing these and are from these communities, you know, constantly seeing your livelihood and who you are just being discussed and debated, oftentimes in negative terms. And I suppose, how do you advise other people to not let that defeat you and to kind of not let that get you down so much? Because it really can, for so many people I know, even myself, it's just, it can be so hard to constantly see that happening. So I suppose, how do you yourself work through that and stay strong in your kind of fight for equality, is my question.
Thank you, Ian. That's a really good question. We're going to talk about activist self-care. And this is something that you know, is not a new thing. Women of color feminists have been talking about self-care and community care and the feminist ethics of care since the 70s. But it's only been kind of mainstreamed in the last decade or so. I've been active in many activist spaces globally and internationally and regionally as well. And in many of these conferences, there are actually spaces where you just, disconnect and cut off and take care of yourself. And there are many ways to do that. The human spirit is very fragile sometimes. While I think there is something to be said of vulnerability and centering vulnerability as an activism, because I do that in my classes all the time. I talk about personal experiences. I talk about the biases that I encounter. I talk about the prejudices that I've encountered in the US and abroad and in other places. I've talked about being sexualized as a brown trans woman. So being vulnerable in public is kind of, it's part of my profession, right? So how do I take the activist hat off? How do I take the academic hat off? And how do I take care of myself? I make Joscelyn do all of my emotional work for me. I'm kidding now. Therapy is really good. If you have access to mental health care, to a therapist, a counselor, I would very highly recommend it. It's not something that's very common in Asia. It's not something that's very easily accessible, even in the West, even in the US. I've been on a wait list for a counselor since September, since we got here, and I still haven't had, one session of counseling yet. In the absence of counseling, I like to shut my brain off. And this is a personal technique. This is why I watch a lot of Korean dramas, because they're just, they're mindless things. I stare at pretty people. My Instagram is full of Korean pop stars and puppies, my happy places. So you have to know how to kind of take care of yourself. And for me, taking care of myself means watching things that I can turn my mind off for. But then, of course, I'm in media studies, so, never really comes off. Sonia will know this. But it's not just specific to trans people, right? Yeah, trans people are being attacked right now because we've become the new cultural icon. We've become the new pawn in the Republican culture wars. But it's also women, queer women who are not necessarily trans, lesbian women, right? Black women, women who don't conform to the expectations of society, cisgender, straight, or whatever, right? And people need to take care of themselves, and find a community. And this is something that Joss and I are very recently discovering, because we're new to California. We moved here from New Zealand. We had a small community in New Zealand who were queer and lovely. And we're trying to find a space where we can feel both supported, but also be able to support other queer, trans people. So finding a community is, I think, also a really important thing. That is why I am in love with Brenda. That is why we are working together, because I trust her and she takes care of me, and she knows that I will take care of her. So we have each other's backs, right? So it's important to have those things. Thank you.
So thank you to all our speakers for their kind sharings, and this will be the end of our Q&A section. So last but not least, let us welcome Dr. Brenda again to give her final responses to the panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Millie. Okay, what can I say? I mean, this panel is a tough act to follow, but I'm just like what Mikey said. Find your community, and I decided to find my community. Actually, this entire group, everyone here, is part of our community. I decided to invite my friends, all of my friends, as our panelists. Our sponsors are our friends as well. Our students, are working with us, and they just did a magnificent job. I mean, I could already say that this is a magnificent set of work that they have done. Of course, our course team, Meg and Raja. So I definitely echo what Mikey just said, and we take care of each other. So how I'll also summarize is I decided to pick out a few things, because they said everything that you said is brilliant, of course, but then I decided to highlight a few of these and how it echoes or how it resonates with me. So like when Sonia was talking about, Sonia and Vera was talking about positive images of women, how in local conservative culture, how women are given, a set of ideas, on how they are supposed to fit in. How that resonated with me is because since I'm a trans woman, I'm a trans Pinay, so I'm from the Philippines. I realized that it's like a lifelong process to prove yourself, to fit in, and we shouldn't go through that. Sometimes I wish I could tell other trans people that they have to stop proving themselves, to others, but then sometimes you end up unconsciously and subconsciously proving yourself, because it's like you prove yourselves in other ways. You may not necessarily have to prove, that you're a woman or a man or what gender you identify as, but you have to prove yourself as a friend. You have to prove yourself as a family member. You have to prove yourself as a member of that community. And it's just going to be a never-ending process. And this harks back to that traumatic experience, I've had 6 years ago, actually here in Hong Kong. Of all places, I thought that this is going to be a very safe space for me. But then here, I was asked the most intrusive and traumatic of questions. Like I was asked if I'm a woman. I was asked if I have a vagina. And I was asked if I was planning to have my surgeries so that I can fit into that expectation, to those expectations. And so this reminds me of the lifelong process that trans people have to go through, when Mikey was talking about the medicalization, the putting of trans people in boxes or in categories, that we have to be reminded that the category of women is not just about biological. It's never biological. We are more than that. We are psychosocial beings. You could use we're philosophical beings. We're metaphysical, probably. We're paranormal beings. We're supernatural, in fact. And in the process, we have to realize that. And we have our community to remind us and to help us, in our journey. As Vera was sharing about positive-based education or sexuality-based education, right? It's important for us to appreciate our bodies and to fulfill. I was talking about a vibrator earlier, or dildo. So how can you actually achieve this? If let's say you have one practical or concrete action to do today, then you could go to a sex shop, Sally Coco's. And because like when I go to Sally Coco's, I actually feel that it's heaven. When you touch that clean dildo, it's an empowering feeling. That can be a simple step, right? Already. And also, Joscelyn earlier reminded us of the definitions of intersectionality. So that's why Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw has actually given us that definition a long time ago, that we have to be reminded that struggles and the oppressions of women differ. And it goes further down as it also goes up for some. And if we look at, we were talking about the suffrage movement, the history of the U.S. suffrage movement last year, as it was I think the centenary last year. And in the suffrage movement itself, we will realize that women of color and trans or queer women were actually invisible. They were put behind the back, right? And that is very sad. And it's still happening today. And it's speaking of sad, I was somehow expecting it, but I didn't realize how it was also triggering, listening to Tekla's sharing, because having lived here in Hong Kong for 11 years, my first friends here in Hong Kong when I moved here are Philippine helpers, domestic workers. And I would say that I'm grateful that they became my friends because they showed me around. But I am sad to actually start hearing about the injustices that they experience on a day-to-day basis. And Tekla just summarized all of these today. It's being reminded of Ariana's situation, some 5 years back. Ariana is a domestic worker from Indonesia, and she won her case against her employer, I think 27 out of 29 counts, because of the extreme violence and the injustices that she has experienced from them for several years. but she was one of the few documented cases. There are many undocumented cases of our helpers experiencing such. And this has never been more glaring than the COVID situation. So when we talk about intersectionality, again, all of us experience COVID, but all of us experience it differently, or each of us experience it differently. And for our domestic workers here, our migrant workers, specifically from Indonesia and in the Philippines, they experience it worse, perhaps. And so what we need is to help amplify the call to action, and Joscelyn mentioned about collective action, and this is very important. So we work together. So when you have your community, we amplify our voices, we support each other. Self-care is important, yes, but we should be radical. Mikey and Sonia also mentioned about radical rethinking and radical action. We should not be apologetic. I thought that I think it's a Filipino characteristic for us to just say sorry when we say something harsh, but I realized that we should not be apologetic. Because we believe in what we're talking about. We would not be here. Our experience speaks for itself already. And I guess, yeah, just like what Jocelyn mentioned also about humanizing each other, that's very important. Being reminded that as humans, our experience are unique. We don't invalidate someone. We don't just go up, the stage and slap someone because we were. I was talking about the Oscars, and I guess that situation is kind of something that we can all learn from. That before we do something, we have to think, right, of how it affects us. And when this session reminds us, when Mikey was telling us about centering trans people in the conversations, I'm reminded of Jennifer Lau there. I'm reminded of Leah Thompson. I'm reminded of Donna Niera and so many other trans people whose womanhood, whose womanness, has always been on the center of conversations, and all for the wrong reasons. And it would take an entire nation, to invalidate your existence. When Jennifer Lau died, Filipino people and netizens just invalidated her by misgendering and then naming her constantly. And what's worse, among the gatekeepers of our identity, like media, experts, here, doctors here and there, did less and probably even exacerbated that situation. I could just go on and on, but I think I'll be very specific with some concrete actions. Like for me, as a Filipina citizen, I'm going to make sure I'm going to choose a leader or a set of leaders who will take care of our nation. So vote for Lenny Robredo as a number 10 on the ballot. I hope that Filipinos watching this, realize that we have to choose a woman. The best person for the job, more often, is a woman, or it's about time that it is a woman. At least in the case of the Philippines, I would say that it's about time, that a woman leads us once more. And elsewhere, it's important to connect. When Mikey was talking about centering trans people, it's important for us to be reminded of cultural identities or cultural realities so that we have erased or have been erased from our consciousness for a long time. So Sonia mentioned post-colonialism, geopolitics, shifts in geopolitics, and it's been happening. But one way to start the conversation is to talk about the Hijras, talk about the Mahus, talk about the Two-Spirit, the Faafafines, Faafakalite, the Warya, the Bugis tribe, and the Babaylan. I talk about the Babaylan or the Asogs constantly because I am proud of where we come from, and sad that about 500 years of our existence has been erased from our consciousness. And I realize even at my age, I can unlearn. Mike talk about learning and unlearning. From theories of learning in psychology, that has been highlighted for us in our psychology lessons. What we learn, we can unlearn. It's just a matter of choice. Your choice of unlearning the bad things is an act of humility. Your choice of being radical in your actions in order to hasten the collective movement of women's rights so that we can truly break barriers is in itself an act of humility. So with that, we break the bias, or we break biases every day. Thank you so much to my friends, our amazing and brilliant speakers who are really you warriors of for women and women's voices. I would like to thank all of you, and of course our partner Bethune House Foundation. Thank you to our speakers for being very kind to Bethune House Foundation. They needed our help, you know, and you came to their time of need. Thank you so much. Thank you to the U.S. Consulate, Adeline, everyone at the U.S. Consulate of Hong Kong and Macau. Thank you for supporting us. Thank you to CGED. Gina, thank you so much for always being a warrior for us. To the GSP program, Elizabeth and Crystal Chan, thank you so much. And to Professor David Pomfret, the School of Humanities, and the Faculty of Arts, Gray, and the Common Core Office, and also the entire course team, Raj and Meg, you did a great job. And of course, Millie, Owen, Graham, Ben, Ziteng, and the entire Group 1. As we sought permission from all of you that we will be recording this session. So once more, thank you. And I give it back to you, Millie, to close the session.